One thing humanity has in common is they take a lot of stuff for granted. Scientists love to use the term force, and they love to use the term waves, and of course there's no such thing as a wave, because a wave is a qualifier of something else. I love it when people say waves, they go, waves of what? In discussing gyromagnetic precession, or the toroidal geometry of force and motion, i.e. magnetism, because to say create space, force and motion, and magnetism and magnitude are all synonymous with one another. The only reason the universe has mass and magnitude is due to force vectors. The native primordial attribute of inertia follows an equation that's actually found in Plato's Republic 509d to 511. That equation is my discovery. That's why I actually tattooed it here on the inside of my right wrist. But defining that toroidal geometry, if you actually take a cross-section of a force vector from a toroidal geometry, I don't know if you've ever seen this neat little toy. It's a toroidal slinky, if you will. It's called a toroflex. But if you actually take one force vector of that, it looks like a circular loop that's bent on its side, and if you actually take that in the fullness of what it is, you'll actually, of course, see the donut, or the toroidal geometry. Gyromagnetic precession is speaking about the moving magnetic field. Of course, then you actually have electromagnetic retardation, and you actually have phase, and you have phase disparity. And here we have time. Of course, time is only a measure of magnitudes. Time itself, of course, does not exist, but the creation of time is an attribute of space, wherein which magnitudes and masses exist. But time is not a thing in and of itself, but of course time gives definition to all phenomenal things, and of course we swim in the sea of time, but that is not to reify time, but actually to define a force vector, to talk about a magnetic field. And man, you have to go right to the very root of all the primordial misunderstandings that humanity has, because humanity is not intellectually evolved enough yet to understand cosmic mechanics. We have all these precursor ideas upon which, by the way, the entire cult of quantum is built, such as the wave-particle duality. I'm speaking about light or photon particles. Well, light doesn't move. The so-called speed of light is a rate of induction. There's no such thing as a wave-particle duality, because a wave is not a thing. A wave is what something else does. Light is certainly not a particle, and there cannot be any dualities in nature, because the fundamental denotation of duality is duplicitousness, and there is no duplicity within natura naturans, or Mother Nature, or the cosmic mechanics, or universal cosmic mechanics, either in whole or in part. There cannot be any duality. So I always laugh every time I hear the words wave-particle duality, or even hearing the word quantum, or even hearing the word photon. There's all these fundamental misunderstandings. There's 1,000 different things you could actually stump, a PhD particle physicist of either physics or quantum mechanics or quantum physics. Just ask them to define a field. Ask them to define energy. Ask them to define polarity. Fundamentally, of course, defining polarity, we actually have to understand what polarity means. And of course, everybody thinks of polarity two-dimensionally. Well, we have poles here. We start from a midpoint, or usually people actually draw not nature's line, but a starting point with the pencil, draw a line to point B. And of course, that's not only two-dimensional, it's inaccurate. A true cosmic mechanics force vector is from counter space. But even then, that's only two-dimensional. A true force vector, of course, is three-dimensional. It's really hard to bend one this way. I actually bent a perfect one and took it to the Science and Energy Conference. It got bent in the process of flying to Idaho, and then someone else liked it so much they thought it was like an arc sculpture. They begged me for it, and I gave it. It's just a bent piece of wire. If you actually hold it on this end, it's supposed to make a perfect circle, but here you can actually see a perfect. This is not perfect. I could bend this a lot better. I only spent like 1 minute bending this, but this gives you kind of an idea. A three-dimensional force vector. If you extrapolate this out, this is painting, if you will, the interior and exterior dimensions of a torus. Enter now in gyromagnetic precession, phase disparity, electromagnetic retardation, and the toroidal geometry that defines force and motion, i.e. centrifugal divergence, i.e. magnetism, i.e. create space. What is magnetism? Magnetism is the dielectric field. And of course, people ask you, what's dielectricity? Actually, I always laugh when people think that I created the term dielectricity or came up with some sort of weird ass word. It's like, if you go into all these books about the gods of field theory, like James Clerk Maxwell, Tesla, Faraday, Steinmetz, Heaviside, the true gods that wrote a mountain of material on field theory and gave us 100% of our current electrical grids and systems and inventions. They spoke about dielectricity endlessly. It's certainly not a word that I came up with. So magnetism is, of course, a dielectric field. There's so many things and so many different facets to explaining magnetism to people. Not only one, people have no idea what polarity is. People think they know what a wave is. People think they know that light moves, and of course light does not move at all. Light does not move at all. Well, a magnet emits a magnetic field. Actually, it doesn't emit anything at all. It's that the ether within the vicinity, or the topos, using the ancient Greek term, the topos of that magnet, there is a perturbation, which is, of course, everything is pressure modality. Everything is force and motion, inertia and acceleration. Everything is capacitance, resistance, magnetic permeability, and dielectric permittivity. It's just that all the fundamental words that people take for granted as understanding what the hell they are, they were brainwashed to believe it was some sort of crazy crap by some sort of crazy-ass scientist from the 1920s. We're talking about Einstein, Niels Bohr, Richard Feynman, Leonard Susskind. There's a whole pile of these wackadoodle. This is what Tesla called fuzzy-haired crackpots. He was referring to Einstein specifically, but they're all fuzzy-haired crackpots. We have to drop these misnomers of... I ask you, can you define what polarity is? Sure, I know what a pole is. It's got two ends, It's like a stick. It's got two poles, just like this. This is polarity. Here's polarity right here. You see this battery is a positive and a negative right here. Well, that's polarity. It is a positive charge here and a negative charge. Now, this is the discharge point. There's only charge and the loss of charge. There's no such thing. And by the way, I'm actually quoting Walter Russell on that, who scoffed at the notion of any such thing as a negative charge. That's just absolutely ridiculous. There's charge, and of course there's a discharge locus, or topos. But referring to a force vector, I ask you to find a force vector. Specifically, we're talking about polarity. When I say force vector and speaking about polarity, the only reason something has poles, if you will, and a magnet actually doesn't have poles. What it actually has is the inverse of counter space, which is the force vector. It is the three-dimensional geometry that defines that centrifugal divergence from counter space, or the plane of inertia. Because at the center of a magnet, if you take a Gauss meter and you stick it between two powerful magnets, you let them smash together without destroying your probe, you'll see that there's no field. There's no field in the middle of two giant magnets. Something interesting, if actually human beings applied retroductive reasoning to understanding field mechanics, they would know. It was like, well, at the center of a magnet, there's no magnetism. At the center of gravity, and there's no such thing as gravity, by the way, at the center of gravity, there's no gravity. Like if you were to fall... If you actually go into the middle of a bubble in the center of the earth, you'd be weightless, right? Just like in a bubble, right? Some sort of indestructible bubble. Center of the earth, there would be no gravity. You'd be weightless. But at the center of a electrostatic or dielectric, there's the highest concentration of same. Center of gravity, there's no gravity. At the center of a magnet, there's no magnetism. But it's complete opposite. That really tells you something. Fundamentally, there is only dielectricity and magnetism. Electricity is phi times psi equals Q in Planck of electrification. By the way, even more brilliant than Tesla, and with almost as many patents, and you've probably never heard of him, and he wrote tons and tons and tons of books, is Charles Proteus Steinmetz. He even himself said, he wrote that book, Electrical Discharges, Waves, and Impulses, in 1917, I believe. And even he then, over 100 years ago, said, all these electrical engineers, they have no frickin' clue. He said they're all screwed up in the head. They don't understand what electricity is. They've complicated it. He said it's the hybrid of dielectricity and magnetism. Of course, he's absolutely correct. And the only way he was actually able to come up with all this, some of Steinmetz's equations are over 20 pages long. You want to talk about brilliant? And here's something else funny. There's a few equations that have never been done that Steinmetz wrote over 100 years ago because they're enormous. That's something to contemplate. Back in that unevolved era in 1915, somebody wrote an equation so big that no one's been able to. It's not that it's wrong, it's just that it's too complicated. That's pretty amazing, actually. It's the exact same reason why no one's able to accurately translate Plotinus, except for myself anyway. Actually able to accurately translate Plotinus today, even though there's 5 different translations of Plotinus into English. They have no idea what he's saying. He's like he's a Martian from another planet. It's the same thing with Steinmetz. Like this guy's an alien. We can't figure out what the fuck he's saying. Excuse my language. Anyway, this is a pretty good bending, if you will, of a 3-dimensional S-curve, and it paints the inside of a toroidal geometry, a true force vector. And of course there are no lines and fields. Maxwellian field equations have never defined a field. They only express a field over a period of time with a given vector with a result measured in joules, watts, volts, yada yada yada. But they never define a field in itself, of itself, by itself. You really want to confuse the hell out of a theoretical physicist, someone that's got a PhD, you know, that's PhD on my wall, I'm a professor of theoretical. Say, hey, Mr. Professor, Mr. Smart Guy, you really think you're smart, but you're not. Define a field, the term field for me. The ancient Greek word for that is kora. Define the word field. They can't. They'll poop their diaper. Ask them to define the term energy. Ask them to define the term polarity. They can't. All these fundamental principles humanity takes for granted. A magnet does not emit a magnetic field. Okay? Light does not travel. People think that, of course, waves break when they actually reach shallow water, but waves out on the ocean, like if you drop a Titanic ship in the middle of the ocean and waves are generated, they don't actually propagate. Well, sure they do. I can see the wave. No, it's causing the next period. The water isn't moving this way. It's creating a pressure. Okay, it's the same thing in a piece of rope. If you tie a piece of rope to the wall over there, and they have the other piece in my hand, and I release some energy, whew, you know, you whip it, right? Like that song, Whip It Good, right? Devo, right? Whip it. You whip a piece of rope and it's tied to the wall over there. Does the rope travel? You see the wave, right? If I whip that rope, releasing energy, right? Here we have a force vector, and here, of course, we have magnetism, right? By the way, the smaller the space, the higher the capacitance. You would think that the larger the transverse electrical magnetic energy, the more powerful it would be. By the way, it's just the opposite. The really, really, really dangerous crap, the stuff that'll kill you, like gamma radiation, is spatially insanely small. The stuff that will give you a sunburn is huge, right? People don't understand that too. When we talk big, we're talking magnetism. When we talk getting smaller and smaller, we're talking about capacitance, i.e. dielectricity. Smaller the space, the higher the capacitance. The larger the space, the more expressive, as is meant and implied, magnetism. This is the conjugate geometry of force and motion, inertia and acceleration. Think of a donut in your head, right? The geometry of the torus. Now take the negative image of that, right? Do you know what that is? It's a hyperboloid, or an hourglass shape. The two superimposed over one another form a sphere. One is the geometry of force and motion, and the other one is the geometry of inertia and acceleration. Centrifugal divergence and centripetal convergence. This is the fundamental secret of the entire universe. If aliens landed tomorrow, the first thing they'd want to know, if we understand cosmic mechanics very simplex, we might not be very evolved in our equipment and whatnot, but if we could actually show them that we understand what dielectricity and magnetism is and show them the conjugate geometry that defines the entire universe, it's like, well, these creatures are evolved enough to actually understand the absolute, utter foundation of the entire universe. Force and motion, inertia and acceleration, cosmic mechanics of dielectricity and magnetism. Anyway, this is a three-dimensional force vector. But getting back to, a magnet emitting magnetism, it doesn't emit anything at all. This is the actual ether in play. You think a light bulb emits light? Sure it does. Now, that's actually a tungsten filament in most cases inside of a glass tube that's evacuated. Partial vacuum, they squirt in some argon so it lasts a lot longer. It's a sealed vessel. It's not emitting anything. It's a field perturbation. If a person is in the middle of a pond flapping their arms and they create waves in the water is the medium, i.e. the ether. Can you say a person is emitting something? You would never say a person is emitting something if they're flapping their arms in the middle of a pond, would you? No. Are they creating waves or disturbances in the water? Sure. It's the same thing a light bulb does. It's the exact same thing a magnet does. The only thing that actually defines a magnet is qualitative, not quantitative. Before a magnet becomes a magnet, it's the exact same thing. The only difference change is the qualitative nature of what it is, i.e. point source magnetism, where the entire thing is acting in a multiplicative fashion. The same difference between a light and a laser, because there's a huge difference between a 5-watt light bulb and a 5-watt laser, even though both are 5 watts, right? Right. Nothing is emitting anything. The only way you could actually understand, and it becomes extremely simple, this is the reason why, by the way, the gods of electrical theory, when the AC generators were so fascinating back in the day, today nobody marvels at an AC generator because nobody gives a shit. They're everywhere, they're ubiquitous, but back in the day, the gods of electrical theory like Steinmetz, Tesla, Heaviside, when the AC generators were operating, they would actually talk about, wow, look at that thing churning up the ether. Those are their words. Repeat after me. Churning up the ether. It's exactly what an AC generator is. Sure, an AC generator is emitting electricity. There's electrons flowing out of those wires and going to your house and in the electrical grid. No, it's not emitting anything. If you think that an AC generator, whether it be powered by water, nuclear, steam, or waterfalls, or air, if you think it's emitting something, then you believe in a bottomless tube of toothpaste. You just keep squeezing that toothpaste and it just keeps squirting it. Like, no. An AC generator is not emitting anything. Who gave you that idea? Why? Your physics professor did. Well, an AC generator is sending trillions and trillions of electrons per millisecond down the wires to your... If you think that AC generators are, sending a gazillion electrons per microsecond, and there's electrons flowing down the power lines in the front and back of your house, kind of like beads down a rain stick. You know what a rain stick is? You know what a rain stick is, right? It's a stick with all those beads in there. So music. If you think that those power lines are passing something physical from one end to the other, you're smoking crack. But you were brought up to believe that stuff. What that is called the cult of atomism. What I specifically call it is the cult of bumping particles, which is not basis in reality. Mother Nature is not a cross-eyed hooker on crack. She doesn't have a bag of magic particles that are bumping. Nothing emits light. Nothing is squirting out electrons through copper wires. A magnet is not emitting magnetism. All these misnomers that we have, there's not a single PhD professor on this earth that will be able to define to you what energy is, what polarity is. They have no idea what energy is. You think we're so evolved because we got computers and iPhones and crap, but humanity hasn't even scratched the surface yet of how the universe really works. And it is not bumping particles, because that's absolutely impossible. Instantaneous action at a distance actually makes that impossible. Oh, but quantum mechanics has an answer for that. It's called spooky quantum interaction. Well, there's negative energy photons tunneling through counter space, and virtual photons are interacting. That's how instant... That's as stupid as saying unicorns and leprechauns. When people start talking like that, you need to stop listening to them, because they're talking out of their ass about things that have never been the output of any experiment ever done. There's no such thing as virtual particles. They have no basis in reality. They're purely conceptual. No basis in reality whatsoever. Anyway, I need to shut up for now. It's really, really late at night. If you like these videos, you can always drop a dime. Tell me to jump off a cliff. You can click the link below. Whatever makes you happy.